It was the autumn of 1887. Meadow Creek was a small village nestled among dense forests and cold valleys. The villagers were hardworking and simple people. Their lives revolved around the fields, the church, and the old marketplace. On autumn evenings, when the winds turned chilly and dry leaves scattered across the roads, a strange somberness would settle over the village. In such weather, the villagers would hurry to shut their doors and sit in the dim glow of their oil lamps, sharing old stories. In those days, the forest near the village was considered desolate and dangerous. People claimed that strange lights could be seen there at night and that the sound of footsteps echoed among the trees. Yet, most dismissed these tales as bedtime stories meant to frighten children. One night, as clouds blanketed the sky and a cold wind rustled the leaves of the old trees in the graveyard, the church's elderly caretaker, Elias, was patrolling among the graves with his lantern. He had performed this duty for years, but that night an unfamiliar fear had settled in his heart. Again and again, he felt as if a shadow was following him. He turned around several times to peer into the darkness but saw only broken gravestones and patches of dry grass swaying gently. Then, all of a sudden, a faint bluish light shimmered from the direction of the forest behind the church. It looked as though the ground itself was pushing the glow upward. Elias squinted his eyes, then cautiously stepped toward the light. Crossing the graveyard wall, he reached the edge of the forest and saw a glowing circular pattern shimmering on the dry leaves. At the center of the circle knelt a man. His back was covered with a metallic, gleaming suit, and both his hands rested on the ground as if he were engaged in some prayer or ritual. Elias's breath caught in his throat. His voice trembled as he asked, Who are you?" The man slowly raised his head. At that very moment, lightning streaked across the sky, briefly illuminating his face. Elias saw that his facial features were human-like, but his eyes glowed faintly blue, shimmering even in the darkness. The man spoke in an unfamiliar tongue, his voice sounding like metal striking against the wind. Terrified, Elias stumbled backward and then ran toward the village, clutching his lantern. He raised an alarm and woke the villagers, but when the men reached the churchyard, there was nothing to be found, only scorched marks on the dry ground and light ashes scattered as if something massive had descended and left behind its imprint. The following evening, the villagers gathered outside the church as Elias recounted his strange encounter. Suddenly, from the direction of the forest, a man appeared. This time he was dressed simply, in worn but ordinary clothes. The villagers stepped back in fear. The man raised both hands and said gently, "Do not harm me, I am not of your world." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. The village priest, Father Johannes, stepped forward and asked, "Who are you, and where have you come from?" The man replied in a calm, measured voice, "My name is Samuel Hawthorne. I do not belong to this earth but to a place far beyond your skies. I have not come to harm you, but time is short." The villagers stood stunned and silent. Father Johannes took Samuel into the church, offering him shelter, though the rest of the villagers remained fearful, yet curious. Over the next few days, Samuel sat near the church during the daylight hours, gazing silently up at the sky. The village children were afraid of him, but one little girl, Annabelle, often came near the church to ask him questions. Samuel spoke to her kindly and would say, "The world stands at the edge of a great trial. Those from beyond the skies are coming to reclaim the land that was once theirs." Annabelle listened in wonder and repeated his words at home, but her mother would scold her, warning her not to believe the ramblings of a stranger. Meanwhile, the villagers noticed that their livestock had begun to vanish. Dead animals were sometimes found in the forest, but there were no wounds on their bodies, as if something had drained the life out of them from within. Near each such place, traces of the same bluish ash were discovered. One night, as the village slept, a thunderous sound echoed across the sky. The frightened villagers rushed outside their homes and saw a glowing blue ring hovering over the forest, sending waves of light down toward the earth. On the doors of some houses, strange burning blue symbols began to appear, as if someone had branded them with a mark. Terrified, the villagers locked their doors. Father Johannes turned to Samuel and asked, "What is happening?" Samuel replied gravely, "They are drawing near. These marks are pathways for them. Those whose homes bear the marks are chosen." The priest trembled. "Chosen? For what?" The glow in Samuel's eyes dimmed slightly as he said, "They seek to reclaim their inheritance of this land. Those who resist will not survive." He fell silent then, gazing at the church door as if sensing an approaching storm. The next morning, the village of Meadow Creek awoke with an unfamiliar dread. The villagers gathered outside the church, whispering anxiously among themselves. The image of the glowing blue circle that had appeared in the sky the night before was burned into everyone's minds. Seeing the strange blue marks that had appeared on the doors of their homes had only deepened their terror. The village elder, Henry Belmont, stepped forward, his voice laced with both anger and fear. Pointing toward the church, he said to the priest, "That stranger is leading us to ruin. My ox vanished from the pen last night. I know this is all his doing. We should drive him out of the village before it's too late." Father Johannes spoke in a calm, steady voice. "Henry, I have spoken with him. He claims he wishes no harm to us. You've seen for yourself, he keeps to himself and has caused no violence." Henry clenched his teeth. "Keeps to himself. Since the moment he arrived, our peace has vanished. Our children are terrified, our animals are disappearing, and now there are devilish signs in the sky." The murmur of agreement spread among the villagers. Father Johannes raised his hands to quiet them. "We cannot act in haste. If he is a danger to us, we need proof." At that moment, the church door creaked open, and Samuel Hawthorne stepped outside. His face showed the weariness of a sleepless night. He looked at the gathered crowd and said quietly, "I understand your fear. But what is coming cannot be stopped by any of you. I came only to warn you." Henry strode forward and growled, "You lie. If you speak the truth, then tell us, what are these blue marks? Why have they appeared on our homes?" Samuel lowered his gaze and let out a heavy sigh. "They are pathways," he said. "Gateways for those who cross the veil of light. Some among your village have been chosen." The villagers gasped in horror. A woman screamed, clutching her shawl. "There's a mark on my daughter's door." Panic rippled through the crowd. Father Johannes turned to Samuel. "If you know this much, then tell us how we can be saved." Samuel stood in silence, the glow in his blue eyes flickering like a distant flame. Finally, he said, "Some destinies have already been written. But perhaps, there is still time. Tonight, I will go beyond the forest. There you will find their signs. But beware, what you see there may chill your very soul." Before nightfall, Samuel set off toward the forest. The priest sent 2 young men, Martin and Jacob, to accompany him. Together, the 3 of them entered the dark forest, carrying torches. Shafts of pale, wavering light flickered between the trees, and the air hummed with a strange, low whispering, as if the forest itself was breathing. They walked for a long while until Samuel finally stopped at a clearing. There on the ground was a large, glowing circle. Strange symbols pulsed within it, throbbing with blue light. Father Johannes murmured a prayer under his breath. Jacob, his voice trembling, whispered, "What kind of ritual is this?" Samuel answered solemnly, "It is their language. These are gates. By some hour of the night, this circle will open. You must hold your courage." Suddenly, a gust of wind rose, and from the center of the circle, a column of blue light shot up into the sky. The 3 men staggered back in fear. Within the pillar of light, shadowy figures began to shift and writhe, as if trapped between 2 worlds. Martin's courage faltered, and he dropped to his knees. Samuel's voice turned sharp and commanding. "Do not close your eyes. If you bow your heads, they will know you." For a fleeting moment, the shape of a human figure appeared within the light. Its face was veiled in mist and radiance, and though it moved its lips, no sound could be heard, only a strange echo that seemed to resonate within the heart. Then the light vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, and the forest was once again swallowed by darkness. Father Johannes, his voice shaking, asked, What was that?" Samuel replied quietly, "It was a warning. They know I am here now. All that remains is to wait for them." The 3 men returned to the village. The frightened villagers crowded around them, desperate for answers, but the priest urged them to remain calm. Still, the shadow of fear loomed over Meadow Creek. That very night, the village was startled awake by the terrified screams of Annabelle's mother. The little girl had vanished from her bed, and on the windowsill lay a thin layer of bluish ash. The villagers scattered into the streets, searching frantically, calling her name. Some, driven by fury and terror, sought out Samuel, but he was nowhere to be found. He had locked himself inside the church. Father Johannes, pale and weary, whispered, "Perhaps he was trying to warn us, perhaps he cannot save us." But Henry's voice rose in anger. "No, this all began with him. Since he arrived, our lives have turned into a nightmare. We must put an end to this, once and for all." Fear and rage swelled in the hearts of the villagers. From the forest, the blue light flickered again and again. More livestock and children began to disappear, and each time, the same burning mark was left on the doors of their homes. Late that night, Samuel found Father Johannes sitting alone in the dim glow of a candle. He stepped forward and spoke in a low, steady voice. "By tomorrow night, you must decide. Either you step aside and let them pass, or you perish with this land." The priest's voice quivered. "Is there no hope at all?" The glow in Samuel's eyes dimmed. "I am only a messenger," he said. "The choice is yours." It was night. All the houses in the village had their doors bolted from the inside, and wooden planks were nailed across the windows. Outside, the deserted streets echoed now and then as the wind snapped branches from the trees, sending them crashing to the ground with a hollow, eerie thud. The villagers huddled inside their homes, the women clutching their children to their chests and murmuring prayers. Pastor Johannes sat silently inside the church. The small oil lamp before him kept flickering, as if an unseen gust of air were passing through the room. Samuel Hawthorne sat on the stone steps near the inner chamber, his head bowed. The blue glow in his eyes dimmed and flickered at times, like a distant star shimmering and then vanishing in the night sky. Breaking the silence, the pastor spoke. "Samuel, why is this happening? If you truly want to save us, then do something. Our children are disappearing one by one." Samuel raised his head and said quietly, "This has become a war. I am a messenger, not a soldier. Their presence is drawing closer. Tomorrow night they will come to look upon the entire village." The pastor's heartbeat quickened. "Tomorrow night. Is there anything we can do?" Samuel turned his gaze toward the church altar and spoke softly. "There is a power in your faith. But you must rise above your fear. If fear rules your heart, they will bend you to their will." Just then, a knock sounded at the church door. When the door was opened, Henry Belmont entered with several villagers at his side. His face was filled with anger and exhaustion. "We can't wait any longer," he said. "Our children are being taken, and you just sit here doing nothing. We must act now." The pastor spoke gently. "Henry, we must not be hasty. We don't yet know what we are facing." Henry snapped. "We know that all this began with that stranger. Either hand him over to us, or we will decide his fate ourselves." Samuel slowly rose and stepped toward Henry. The blue glow in his eyes brightened for an instant. "If you try to harm me, you will face those you cannot even see. I am not your enemy, but if you force my hand, you will be responsible for your own destruction." Henry gritted his teeth. "We do not believe your words. If our children are not returned by tomorrow, we will not tolerate this." With that, he turned and left the church. Outside, the wind had grown harsher, and from time to time a flicker of blue light glimmered between the dark clouds in the sky. Night deepened. In the eastern part of the village stood an old barn that had been abandoned for years. That night, strange sounds were heard coming from it. Some young men ran to the church and told the pastor they had seen a light inside the deserted barn. The pastor looked at Samuel. "What is happening?" Samuel closed his eyes as if listening to a distant voice. Then he said slowly, "They are opening their gates. Tonight another trial begins." Summoning his courage, the pastor decided to go there himself. He took along two strong young men, Jacob and Lucas, and together they set off toward the barn, carrying lanterns. Samuel went with them. The path was dark, and as they brushed against the thickets, it sounded like the hiss of snakes. The air was damp and carried a strange, musty odor. When they reached the barn, they saw a faint blue light seeping out through the broken windows. The door creaked open like an old church bell. The air inside was cold and still. In the center of the barn floor, they found a circle drawn, with old pieces of wood placed along its edge. Strange letters, written in an unknown language, were carved into them. The pastor began to recite a verse from the Bible, but his voice trembled. Jacob, summoning his courage, stepped closer to the Circle, when suddenly, a brilliant column of light shot up from the center of the circle, and a terrible sound echoed through the room. It was neither human nor animal, but rather like the screech of grinding metal. Samuel shouted, "Step back!" But it was too late. Jacob fell at the edge of the circle as a blue glow wrapped itself around his body. He screamed, but no one could help him. A moment later, he vanished into the light, leaving only a torn piece of his clothing on the floor. The pastor and Lucas stood frozen in fear. Samuel said sternly, "This is their gate. Your people are now entering their world. By tomorrow night, they will be even closer." They all returned to the village, but no one spoke a word. Everyone remained under the shadow of fear until morning. The next morning, Henry announced that enough was enough. He and several other young men would take up weapons, go into the forest, and destroy the circle of light. The pastor tried to stop them, but Henry refused to listen. By afternoon, they set off into the forest, while the villagers stood outside the church, watching them leave. The pastor turned to Samuel and said, "They are inviting disaster." Samuel simply replied, "They do not know that what they are going to fight is not made of flesh and blood." As evening fell, a brilliant light flared above the village, and screams could be heard from the direction of the forest. The women began to weep, and the children huddled inside the church in terror. The men did not return for the rest of the night. At last, two of Henry's companions staggered back to the village, their faces pale and their eyes filled with horror. They could only say that shapes like human shadows had emerged from the light, shapes that did not walk on the ground but floated in the air. Henry and the others had been swallowed by the storm of light. The pastor gathered everyone inside the church. The villagers prayed desperately while, outside, the blue glow in the direction of the forest grew ever brighter. Samuel stood near the altar and said quietly, "Time is running out. By tomorrow night, they will be among you." That night in the village was eerily silent. There was no sound of dogs barking, nor the rustling of tree branches. The heavy clouds above looked like a black ocean from another world spread across the sky. Inside the church, everyone had gathered together. The candles flickered, their flames trembling and dimming as though pressed down by an unseen breath. Pastor Johannes clutched the Bible to his chest. His lips moved silently in prayer. Samuel Hawthorne stood near the church's main entrance. The blue glow in his eyes had grown brighter, and there was a strange mixture of solemnity and sadness on his face. The children sitting inside the church began to cry, and their mothers tried to hush them. An old woman turned to Samuel and asked in a trembling voice, "If you cannot save us, then tell us the truth. How long do we have to live?" Samuel looked at her and said gently, "I came here to save you. But what is coming draws its strength from your fear. If you give in to fear, they will win." With that, he closed the church door. Outside, faint streaks of blue light appeared, as though serpents of light were slithering from the depths of the forest toward the village. Just then, a thunderous crash shook the ground near the church. The people screamed. Some candles went out, and in the darkness, only the blue glow of Samuel's eyes could be seen. He said to the pastor, "This is their first strike. They cannot fully enter the walls of the church. But we will not be safe here for long." The pastor asked, "Then what must we do?" Samuel paused for a moment and then replied, "We must close their gate. That circle of light you saw in the barn is the path to their world. If it is not destroyed, this village will become their prey." A few of the village's young men gathered their courage and said, "We will go with you." In the late hours of the night, Samuel, the pastor, and 5 brave men from the village left the church. The rest remained inside, praying silently. Thunder rolled across the sky, but no rain fell. The branches of the village trees seemed to glow faintly blue, as if they were burning with cold fire. As they drew closer to the barn, the ground grew colder. Their breaths appeared like pale mist in the air. When they reached the barn door, Samuel raised his hand to signal them to stop. From inside came a low, dreadful whispering sound. The pastor opened his Bible and began to recite a prayer. At that moment, a towering pillar of light shot up from the center of the circle inside the barn, and a thunderous voice roared. The words were not of any known language, yet they struck at the hearts of the men. Some of the villagers stepped back in fear, but Samuel raised both his hands toward the sky. The glow in his eyes grew so bright it illuminated the entire room. Suddenly, from the pillar of light emerged a horde of shadows. They looked almost human, but their eyes burned with red flames, and their movements twisted and writhed like serpents. They shrieked as they struggled to break free of the circle. Samuel shouted in a commanding voice, "Go back. This land is not yours." At his words, blue flames flared up from the edges of the circle, forcing the shadows to retreat. But one shadow was stronger than the rest. Its scream sounded like thousands of stones shattering at once. It hurled itself at Samuel, and a powerful wave of light burst forth where they clashed. The pastor and the villagers stood frozen in terror as they watched. Samuel, straining with all his might, forced the shadow back into the circle. Then he turned to the pastor and cried out, "Pray now. This is the moment." With tears streaming down his face, the pastor began to pray aloud. As he spoke the final words of his prayer, the symbols drawn around the circle flared brightly and turned to ash. The pillar of light vanished with a piercing wail, and the shadows disappeared. For a moment, the barn was plunged into silence and darkness. But Samuel had collapsed to the ground. His breathing was heavy and weak. The pastor knelt beside him and said, "You saved us." Samuel smiled faintly and whispered, "I am going back. This was my duty." As he spoke, the blue glow in his eyes slowly faded, and his body dissolved into a soft shimmer of light before vanishing entirely. The pastor and the villagers stood there in stunned silence. Overhead, the clouds began to part, and the pale moonlight fell softly upon the earth. From the forest, there came no sound. They returned to the church. When the women and children heard what had happened, they wept, not in fear, but in relief and peace. The next morning, the villagers went to the barn. All that remained there was scorched earth and small heaps of blackened ash. There was no trace of the circle of light, only a faint bluish stain in the center of the ground, as though a gateway to another world had once stood there. Time passed. Slowly, the village returned to its ordinary life. But often, at night, the pastor would sit alone in the church, gazing up at the sky and wondering if someday, somewhere, another gate might open, and whether someone like Samuel would be sent to guard it again. For more real and thrilling stories, subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit the bell icon for updates.